Hello and welcome to Arena. Arena is a place for questions, for big questions. This time around, we're looking at questions of sex, death, and the meaning of life. That is to say, we're asking questions about where we're from and where we're going and what we're supposed to do in the meantime, and looking at how Jesus answers all those questions in a deep and satisfying way. Now, if someone were to ask you on the street after this, what is the meaning of life? I wonder what you might say to them. Or to make the question slightly more easy, if someone asks you, what is it that makes life meaningful? What might you say? Now, there are some very obvious early contenders, things we could probably all agree on. Our relationships give meaning to our lives, whether that's our family relationships, relationships with our friends, our working relationships, romantic relationships. Relationships with other people give us true and deep meaning. Or perhaps not relationships. Perhaps for you, it's achievement that makes life meaningful. The sense of making a difference, of accomplishing things. Perhaps even having some sort of legacy, something that lives on after you. Perhaps that is what it is that gives meaning to your life. And that's actually a fairly common idea in all sorts of ways of thinking. A lot of us want something to live on after us. Even if you don't believe in a literal soul or spirit that lives on and goes to heaven or hell after you die, a lot of us want to be remembered somehow. You might have grand ambitions of being remembered by many, many people, having a statue put up in your honour or a day named after you in the calendar. Or it might be much more modest ambitions, that we would like to be remembered by our friends, our families, and those we worked with. Or perhaps there's really no meaning at all. The whole thing's a trick. This is just something that humans do. We're a strange animal and we look for patterns, for meaning, even when there's nothing. The whole time we're really being fooled by randomness, but trying to make sense of it. And really there's a much more difficult question than what is the meaning of life, which is, how would you know what the meaning of life is anyway? Well, as Christians, we have two fundamental convictions on this topic. Firstly, that life and the universe does really have genuine meaning. And the second is that it's only as we understand who Jesus Christ is that we properly understand what that meaning is. And even before we get to the more contentious question of precisely who Jesus is, he does seem like a pretty good place to start. After all, by most metrics, Jesus had an extraordinarily meaningful life. If we say that relationships are what make life meaningful, well, Jesus had plenty of meaningful relationships. Of course, people like to joke about his most underrated miracle of all, being a man in his 30s with 12 close friends. If you think spirituality is a part of having a meaningful life, well, you'd have to score Jesus pretty highly on the spirituality front as well. Or perhaps it's our achievements or accomplishments, perhaps making a difference in the world is what gives our life meaning. Well, here, Jesus really has very few contenders. Hardly anyone, particularly in the West, has made as much of an impact on our world as Jesus of Nazareth. And to answer the question of who Jesus is, which will take us to the heart of who we are and what we're made for, we're going to be looking at this book, the Gospel of John, an account of Jesus' life written by one of his closest friends. And to begin at the beginning, John starts at the beginning of everything. He writes this on the first page, the first line: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." This is the foundation of the Christian claim that anything has meaning at all, that in the beginning there was a meaningful, purpose-giving Word. Now, John uses this word in a way that has perhaps a few different meanings. Anyone who was familiar with Greek philosophy at the time would have understood something of what he meant. The word that is the organizing principle of the universe. Any of his readers who are familiar with the Hebrew Bible would have been familiar with what he meant, thinking of God's life-giving, creative word, that God spoke at the beginning of creation and everything came into being. And even for us, who are just native English speakers, who perhaps don't know the Bible or Greek philosophy that well, we still understand something of that. Words exist to carry, to convey, to express meaning. At the beginning, John says, there was meaning because in the beginning there was the Word. Which means that the universe is intelligible to us as humans. Obviously, it's still somewhat mysterious, but it's intelligible because in the beginning there was an intelligence. There is meaning in life because there was meaning in God in the beginning. And more than that, the foundation of this meaning is personal. Let me keep reading. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. This word isn't just a vague, impersonal force. It's not just a generic it, but it's a personal, relational he. He was with God in the beginning. But even if that was so, even if there were meaning, even if there were a God behind everything, how could we know that meaning? Well, this is where that second fundamental Christian claim comes in. That it's as we look at Jesus that we understand what that meaning is. Let's skip ahead to verse 14, because this is where the twist comes. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. John is saying that at a very specific point in history, the Word became flesh, the meaning became man. Now that is shocking, and that is new. Of course, a lot of people before John had said that there was meaning in the universe and meaning in life. And a lot of people before John had said that there was a God behind everything. But no one had quite suggested that in a concrete, specific, historic way, that meaning could come and explain itself to us. That God could come into the world and show us what the purpose of life is. That the meaning could become man. That God would move into the human neighbourhood. But that is the central claim of this book, that 2,000 years ago, in towns that still exist, God moved into the human neighbourhood. Jesus of Nazareth was God in the flesh. The one who made everything and defines the purpose of everything came into the world to reveal God to us. Now that, no doubt, would throw up all sorts of questions, particularly questions about how we would or how we should respond to God if we were to meet him face to face. But it also opens up the possibility of all sorts of answers that we might not have thought possible otherwise. Answers about who we are and what our purpose is. But even more importantly, answers about who God is, because what this book is saying is that what you see with Jesus is what you get with God. Everything that Jesus does and says, everything he's like, well, that's exactly the sort of thing that God says and does. It's exactly what God is like. So if you were to meet God, what would you expect him to be like? Well, the rest of the book will show us what he's like, but John gives us a little teaser in verse 14. He says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." In each talk and discussion in this series, we'll be trying to answer big questions about the meaning of life, and we'll try to answer all of them in relation to this most fascinating person, Jesus Christ. And I hope that through that we'll be able to find deep and satisfying answers that are true and answers that are glorious.